Nuclear ambiguity, strategic success, or moral failure. Avner is at the Monterey Institute. He's head of the Non-Proliferation Education Program, which is within the Monterey Institute that has, as he was explaining to me just recently a while ago, is connected to Middlebury College.
And we are graduate school of Middlebury College.
The graduate school of Middlebury College. So it's bi-coastal, so if you survive the winters of Vermont, then you get to get your graduate degree in California. He is very well known for his first book, Israel and the Bomb, 1999, and recently...
98.
98?
Paperback 99.
It says it.
First edition 98.
Okay. And then the book that we'll have for sale there, The Worst Kept Secret, Israel's Bargain with the Bomb, which first came out in 2010, right? And this paperback. So it really is a special honor to have him address this topic, which is of such enormous importance in the world and usually skirted and avoided by most observers and commentators. But I want to begin with a little story. So once upon a time, there were two weavers. And these two weavers they were con men. And they came to this town, which was the capital city of the kingdom. And they said they were making some special clothes, magical clothes they were going to weave. And the word got around, and it got back to the emperor. And there was a trick to these special clothes, however, that only the stupid and the incompetent were unable to see it, to see the clothes. So the emperor thought this was a wonderful opportunity to ferret out the stupid and the incompetent in his kingdom. So he ordered the two weavers to come to the palace and asked them to make a special suit of clothes for him. And they worked night and day, and they came out with their golden fleece and all kinds of fancy clothes and dressed in. And then he got in his carriage, pulled by 6 white steeds, and went out to have all the people admire him. And he was riding along in his carriage. Of course, he had nothing but underpants on. And everybody, however, was afraid to say that the emperor had no clothes because they knew that would reveal them as being stupid and incompetent. So everybody cheered the emperor as he went along. Suddenly, halfway through this parade of cheering people, a little boy said, "Wait a minute, the emperor has no clothes. What's going on?" At which point, the emperor looked down and in fact had to acknowledge that he had no clothes, hid his head in shame, turned the carriage around, went back to the palace. So the moral of this is that Avner is the little boy who speaks truth to power.
Thank you, Chuck, for this lovely introduction. It is very kind of you. I appreciate that. Indeed, I have given maybe nearly 20 years of my life to research of this thing. By the way, I think it's a very interesting picture when you look at the body language of the two of them. Golda Meir was almost a decade older than Richard Nixon when she met him. And it's kind of interesting, almost a motherly figure with a younger man in a kind of serious conversation, trying to, it's an interesting picture. In any case, the story of Israel and the bomb is a very unique story because there is a great deal of uniqueness and exceptionalism about Israel having nuclear weapons, the way it has acquired those nuclear weapons, and in particular, how Israel, and it could not have done it alone, how Israel essentially and the United States have tried to manage the fact that cannot be, to this day, so many years, at least 4 decades, more than almost 5 decades after, cannot be acknowledged the fact that Israel is the only power in the Middle East with nuclear weapons. So there is something very strange. Israel, of course, is the 6th nation in the world to acquire nuclear weapons. By now we have 8 nations. If you want to consider North Korea, it's 9 nations. And yet of all these 9 nations, and again, Israel got the bomb, according to Avner Cohen, at least. It was a very intriguing moment on the days of May 1967, literally days before the 1967 war, when Israeli technicians and engineers and scientists were involved in putting together for the first time a device, not yet a bomb in the full sense of the word, that is not something that could be delivered from aircraft, but something that could be carried possibly by a helicopter somewhere in the desert, never tested before, but something that if Israel would find itself in a remarkably intolerable situation, the Prime Minister will have the last final card to demonstrate capability, with the hope that the big power will say to the parties involved, children, enough is enough. We don't want you to see you anymore playing with what you have. And this was a very unique moment when there was some kind of preparation were made, if the case will come to that. Obviously, this did not happen. On the morning of June 5th, Israel was able in 3 hours to destroy essentially 3 Arab air forces, Egypt and Syria, and to some extent part of Jordan, and the war was over essentially by that late morning. It took another 5.5 days until it was completely over, but nevertheless, there was no any need to demonstrate that capability. But that capability for the first time brought into some kind of operational readiness, and ever since, Israel has that kind of capabilities. 1967, today we're 2014, it's almost 50 years. And yet, the taboo, the inhibition about saying it has remained to this day. So the little story that Chuck mentioned obviously makes me chuckle. I think it was my first piece in the New York Times about the Vanunu, and perhaps the first person who did was not Avner Cohen, but actually the poor man that understood the story in part, who after some years of working there at Dimona, at the Israeli nuclear facility, realized that he wants to tell something that he thinks the world does not know, even though he didn't understand that everybody does know except him, and he is the one who's very much the naive, who thinks that the world does know. He went all the way, as far as one could go, to Australia to find some journalists to make connection to the British, the Sunday Times, and the story came out in 1986, and indeed in some of the first cartoon about Mordechai Vanunu, that it was very much Mordechai Vanunu as the little boy who is telling the king, the emperor has no clothing. Years later, in a piece that I wrote about Vanunu, I think my first piece in the New York Times, 1987, I believe, when he was convicted and was got his 18 years imprisonment, the editor of the New York Times used the same kind of metaphor. The emperor has no clothing, in reference to illustrate my little piece. So the kind of question that I would like to raise with you today, and essentially it's to some extent the central question of my this book, is indeed an effort to reflect 40 or 45 years later about the Israeli nuclear program. It is very odd. As I said, it is the only one today among the 8 or 9, depends if you consider or not consider North Korea as having nuclear weapon states, that Israel, all those years, has not found a way to live with its bomb in a semi-legitimate way, to put it on the table, to acknowledge it, To this day, the Israeli bomb is the only bomb which has not been acknowledged, which has not been declared, which has not been admitted, and in some respect, and I'm going to develop it a little bit further, Israel has never taken full responsibility for that possession. That's quite remarkable. So the kind of reflection that I would like to raise is this reflection between, on the one hand, this strategic smartness, strategic innovation of how to live with the bomb and to get how to extract as much as possible strategic benefits that at least many years ago the country felt, or the leaders of the country felt, that they need to extract from the bomb some kind of benefits, and we'll talk about these benefits. And yet, to this very day, so many years later, yet the country, the nation as a whole, the society as a whole, the Israeli society as a whole, has not found a way to live with that. This is something which is unacknowledged, and I'm going to say something about the mechanisms, the institutions, the various laws that all of them have to manage this strange absence. It's about the big elephant in the room, the big gorilla in the room, which has a certain kind of presence, and yet that presence is lies in its absence. Sounds paradoxical, but that's a very unique story, and you live with that kind of attitude for a long, long time. One more layer of complexity is the American complicity with this. Israel could not have done that unique, and again, I'm a little bit at loss, what word should I use? Achievement, arrangement, bargain, again, depends how you think about it. Israel could not have that, whatever, without the direct participation, without the direct complicity of the United States. And that brings us to that day. In a moment, I'll say a little bit more about it. Right now, I'm just trying to give you a little very basic. What happened to the next slides? And that happened with that deal that we saw the picture of Richard Nixon and Golda Meir on that day, on September 26, 1969, which I could call it. So what I would like to talk today is the word in Hebrew for that unique predicament, unique situation. It's called in Hebrew amimut. Literally, that means ambiguity or opacity. But in this context, I use it in much more broader context. That is to say, it's the entire, it's not just a policy, and it's definitely not just a governmental policy, but rather it is an arrangement, a deal, a bargain, a contract between, to some extent, and that's why I'm saying it's much larger than just policy, between people and their government, even though it has never been written down, it somewhat has been transmitted, including the norms how to function and how to regulate it function in a very tacit way without explicit rules. And in the second layer, it's not only between Israel and its people, and by the way, since Golda Meir, and in a moment we'll start with the beginning, David Ben-Gurion, Levi Eshkol, Golda Meir, and so forth, we're talking about some 14 or 15 Israeli prime ministers, to this very day to Benjamin Netanyahu. And all of them have not changed essentially much. Almost no, if you look formally, not one single iota has changed with that kind of arrangement, at least on the formal side. So that's something left or right, whoever was in the government of Israel. So that's amazingly robust and long-held arrangement. And one cannot but ask questions about how sociologically, politically, psychologically, that kind of arrangement, the king has no, the emperor has no clothing, was and has been able to be sustained for that long. And in the second level, the second tier, is the fact that so many American administrations, ever since Richard Nixon, all of them, with at times with a little tiny degree of hesitations, have adhered to that deal that made the United States to be some kind of party to this gentleman agreement, and yet nothing, in a moment I'll tell you a few anecdotes about that, nothing essentially has remained in public. And perhaps there is even very little evidence, direct evidence, trail of paper, from the arrangement as it was done long time ago between Richard Nixon and Golda Meir. I'll say 2 words about that in the future. So that's essentially the issue that I would like to raise, at least for your thinking, for your reflection, and that's what I was trying to do in this book. This book, which was the first book, Israel in the Bomb, came out in 1998, paperback 1999, was the result of nearly a decade of research. I looked over, without exaggeration, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of documents. I've interviewed, at a time, nearly 200 former officials, Israeli, Americans, Norwegians, French, British, and I got all sorts of stories and anecdotes about that. It was at that time there was essentially, it was known from media clips, from press clips, but essentially it was a story without a biography. It was about a being, an entity with life of its own, the life of Dimona, but it never has an author who wrote the narrative of its own biography. And to some extent, I was the first one who was trying to do it. There is still a great deal of things that I do not know today, and of course I had not known at the time, and I think the story to these days, we know only some aspect of that. I have some hints. Itai and I had a lunch, and we talked about some anecdote about something that happened in 1980. There are so many elements of that story that are still totally unknown to the public anywhere. And when I say anywhere, I mean not only in Israel, in the United States, in Europe, including Norway, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere, South Africa and elsewhere. So it's a story that we know only bits and pieces. So I wrote what I knew, or some element that I knew about that, in 1998. The book was published in 98. I had to face, by the way, personally, investigation and the possibility of being tried. It was very close to that. Had I been tried, I would spend years in jail. So I took a certain risk in doing that. And in 2010, the book that came, the second book, is a kind of companion, but it's trying to, not so much to tell the story that I told in 98, which was essentially the story from 1948 until the deal between Nixon and Golda in 1969. So it's covered a very limited and well-defined historical period. But in the other book, it was more an effort to try to deal with the question that I'm asking here, the questions of how to think about it. There are some obvious strategic merits. There are some issues which are possibly, at least in my view, are moral, democratic flaws in that regime, the regime of capacity, how to think the balance. And ultimately, the real question is, when you think in the perspective of today, has it served Israel or has it not? Has it helped to peace or has it not? Has it helped to normalize the Israeli situation, the Israeli predicament, or has it not? Had it highlight elements of exceptionalism versus normality? And I'm talking about it both in the psychological sense, but also in the political sense. Interestingly enough, all those questions, this is part, in my view, of the flaws of the predicament, have, I think it's fair to say what I'm going to say, have hardly been discussed, let alone explored academically in Israel itself. This is questions that are still being considered in Israel itself taboo. Taboo historically, taboo in terms of social science, taboo in terms of even law, and in terms of actual questions of the kind of questions that I ask about peace, about the Israeli psyche itself. And I believe that at least it is time to ask this question, and that's the reason why I've... Just air conditioned? Okay.
But it's in the kitchen. We can't do it.
So that's part of the reason, and that's some of the questions that I would like to entertain or to reflect with you. It doesn't mean, of course, that we will reach final answer. I have some of my own answer. I'm not trying to, I will not be trying to impose it upon you, but at least I would like to take you into some thinking with me about questions that indeed hardly being asked, both on the factual side as well as on the reflective side, the moral side of those questions. So that's roughly what I would like to do with you in the next 40 minutes or so. We go slow, that's okay. And the book is right here, and they were kind to me. They even brought them in. If anybody's interested, I'll be happy to sign it. I would like to start with presenting the very fundamental dilemma that Israel dealt with. And it's interesting that that dilemma has some basic features, but historically coming back in variety of ways, in variety of historical manifestation. And in the last time that it comes vis-a-vis the questions of how Israel should respond with Iran and how the issue of Iran's nuclear program is relevant to Israel and all that those nexus of question. Essentially, the two horns of the dilemma, the two aspects that drive this dilemma, and that's why it is a dilemma, is on the one hand a desire for ultimate security, and nuclear weapons represent the symbol of ultimate security, and on the other hand, the fear or the anxiety of what nuclear weapons entails, which is obviously destruction of the magnitude that humanity has not known before, anything like that before 1945. And obviously the kind of damage that nuclear weapons entails is something that is remarkable. So on the one hand, it's desire to have security, but at the same time, if the enemy would have it, you put yourself, and if you brought that kind of arms race to the point that your enemy has it, you put yourself in vulnerability and ultimately in anxiety of the one that you don't want to create. So what to do? To look for the ultimate security, or to avoid the ultimate security? And you see the kind of interesting way that Israel responded to that. It's, I put it, the resolve to look for that security, the search, the quest for the ultimate weapons, but at the same time there is the element of political caution. The element of the Holocaust, which is one of the things that Israel today has been so deeply inflicted, and in some respect Holocaust is not possibly the worst calamity that the 20th century has given to us, but in some respect it's a living thing that Israel today still has it as part of its own psyche, and unfortunately part of its present living in Israel is not terribly helpful for peace, because it's created a certain kind of paranoia and a certain kind of elements that today still shape Israeli policy. When Prime Minister Netanyahu looks at Iran and he sees Hitler of 1938 and he talks about Iran as nuclear weapons, as the possibly Nazi Germany, that's just one more testimony, striking testimony to the presence of the Holocaust today. So the Holocaust play a very interesting role in that dilemma that I described. One can talk about it that in order to prevent, let's put it this way, the desire for the ultimate weapons is directly connected with the oath, with the commitment of modern Israel, Israel's state, never again, never to have another Holocaust. And only nuclear weapons could give Israel that sense of security, that no kind of thing, such a Holocaust, can happen again to Israel, today the center of the Jewish people. But at the same time, if the other side would have nuclear weapons, and God forbid, if Israel's own action would lead the other side to have nuclear weapons, and when I'm talking about the other side, it could be Egypt, as it was the concern in the 60s, or Iraq, as it was the concern in the 70s and the 80s, or Iran, as is the concern today. If the other side will have the bomb, then no matter what, Israel would be still, no matter how much punishment Israel can cause the other one, Israel is still vulnerable to enormous amount of destruction. So on the one hand, if you want ultimate security, the motto is, and again the Holocaust, in order to prevent another Auschwitz, Israel must be in a position to possess the weapons that could cause another Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm using landmarks of World War II, Auschwitz on the one hand, Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the other hand. So this is the quest for ultimate security. But at the same time, once you legitimize that kind of weapons, once you allow that kind of weapons to introduce to the region and the other side sooner or later would get it, you are putting yourself in position of vulnerability, the ultimate vulnerability. So the desire to get the bomb ultimately could put you in the ultimate invulnerability. And this was the dilemma. And interestingly enough, this was in a debate that took place, and again, Israelis are deprived from that history. I happened to hear about that debate from a participant who essentially prepared the memos for the participant in that debate in 1962. That participant, I mentioned it to Itai during our lunch. His name was Sini. He died 2007. He was the aide to Israel Galili, a well-known Israeli minister. At the time, he was one of the leaders of Achdut Avodah, a junior partner in the cabinet at the time in the 60s. And Ben-Gurion decided at that time, for the first time, to have a strategic debate. Until that, the whole project was completely secret. Essentially, it was ran and owned by the leader. He initiated. By the leader means he had a chief executive officer. It happened to be a very young wonder man, they called him at the time, named Shimon Peres. Shimon Peres, today the president of Israel, was at the time a man in his early mid-30s, and he was the one who was the willing dealing around that project essentially from the mid-50s. But 1962, when the project, when Dimona was getting closer to the need to make some further decision, what's all about, how far we want to go, Ben-Gurion needed to have some kind of legitimacy, and for the first time, he allowed some serious, still insiders, the leaders of Achdut Avodah, all of them have credentials on defense. Igal Alon and was the leader of the Palmach, and Israel Galili was also like the first chief of staff before the state even, and they make that kind of debate. And the debate remind us academics, I don't know to what extent you know it, but there was debate between a colleague, Scott Sagan, and Kenneth Walls, who passed away a few years ago, in political science about whether proliferation is good or bad. Scott Sagan, professor at Stanford, was the representative of the view it's bad. Kenneth Walls will say maybe it brings some kind of stability and rationality. It's not necessarily bad, maybe it's even good. That kind of debate in the context of the Middle East took place in Israel in 1962. And Ben-Gurion listened to both sides. On the sides of Ken Waltz, the people who advocated the nuclear, essentially the person who wanted Israel to join openly to the nuclear club was Shimon Peres, at that time essentially the CEO of the project. And his view was that Israel should be like France, and he was coming and going frequently from France. He saw the way that the nuclear stuff was run in France, and he thought Israel should join the nuclear club by ultimately making tests and by openly getting into the club. The leaders of Dut Avodah, they thought if we're going to have it, the Arabs, one of them, jointly, individually, whatever, they will have it too. And they said, we would cause ourselves to be vulnerable to another Holocaust. Our own action to prevent Holocaust would, in themselves, would create a situation that would make us more than anything else vulnerable to another Holocaust. Our interest is to keep an edge, and if possible, maybe it's not possible, but if possible, to bring to a situation not to introduce nuclear weapons in the region. Ben-Gurion took the compromise, and the compromise ultimately led to Amimut, and the compromise essentially was taking elements from this one and from that one, from the resolve and from the caution. And the result ultimately led to the policy of today. Essentially, he said, we're not going to stop with the project. We're not going to accelerate the project as Peres wanted, but the project would continue. But at least for the time being, and he left office a year later, but at least for the time being, Israel's conventional army will be the strong. This is the national insurance policy. This, the nuclear project, is the national insurance policy. We are not going to acknowledge it. We are not going to join the nuclear club, but we are not going to neglect it. And at the present time, any effort to try to look for nuclear weapons free zone or something like that is naivete. So we are having it, we're working it, but we're not introducing it. Some way to do that is to try to look for the impossible, but this is essentially the seeds of this policy of Amimut. Essentially, it's to have the cake and to eat it too, to have both elements. And it reflects a deep attitude, I believe, of ambivalence towards nuclear weapons. You want it, there is something sweet about it, there is promise of security, but you are also consciously very aware of its incredible danger, and you do not want to accelerate on your own arms race in your own backyard, in your own region. So you want to enjoy some benefits, you're not going to give it up, but you want to do everything possible to keep monopoly, not to allow a situation of parity, not to even parity in the sense that you have a great deal and they have little. Even that it's bad enough. This is, by the way, and I'll come to it towards the end of it, is relevant to the way that Israel thinks today about Iran. You want to keep monopoly, and you don't want to create even the appearance, even the resemblance of some sort of parity. And that decision by Ben-Gurion, even though at the time it was something much more concrete, budget, formation of some military army, was well entrenched ultimately for the long run in terms of legacy, how Israel think about nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapon, whatever she has, is not incorporated into the regular army, is not being thinking as just another type of weapons. It's a capability that is left at the side of the leader, of the captain. It's not part of the normal way you think about military. You don't try to regularize it, you don't try to normalize it as another kind of weapons, but at the same time you continue to keep and to allocate some kind of what you have in terms of budget and efforts and resources to that kind of national insurance policy. So this was already in that decision, 1962. And by the way, it's interesting, 1962, Israel decided in response to Egypt dealing with missiles to develop its own missiles. First, it's being developed in France by Marcel Dassault, French manufacturer, and ultimately after the French embargo following the 1967 war, it's being produced in Israel itself by the Israeli aviation industries. And over the years, over the decades, Israel excelled, and what has become the Jericho 1 became the Jericho 2 and Jericho 3, and yet the decision was, this is not going to be part of the army, this is not going to be part of the even the regular Air Force. It's a special thing. Ultimately, you need to create some kind of liaison with the military, but you don't treat it as something, as just special military asset. This is not treated as military assets. So in many ways, Israel responded to the dilemma on both sides. We are not going to choose one over the other. If there is resolve, we take resolve. But also we do not neglect caution. And if you look, and as I did in that book, and there is a full chapter that I'm looking at, the big 5 or 6 big Israeli nuclear decision from the very beginning, they either go on the resolve side or they go on the caution side. The resolve side was the beginning, the building and erecting this complex of Dimona. On the caution side was never acknowledging it as nuclear weapons program publicly, keeping even the first statement of Ben-Gurion pretended to be just for agriculture, for science, for development, for this and that, but you don't acknowledge the security element of that. Resolve side, Israel did not join the NPT, but at the same time, Israel took a very, very cautious side that kept this opacity. So it's combination of these two elements that you want to keep the element of resolve and the element of caution. And this is, to this day, it reflects that kind of dialectics between resolve, especially technological resolve, and political diplomatic caution is the certain kind of dialectics that to these days have characterized the way that Israel dealt with this nuclear project. And ultimately, the moral flaws in part relates to the extra caution. I mean, it's not just arbitrary, the fact that Israel has, I mean, everybody knows, even in 1986, when Vanunu was telling the world that Israel has the bomb, everybody knew that. That's why he was like the little boy who is telling what everybody knows, all the adults do know. But the game about it was to some extent a game of caution. Yet, so this was part of the strategic game. There was something smart about it. But at the same time, there was some basic fundamental flaws. And again, for me, the main moral is to what extent and to how to think about this trade-off between the merits and the smartness and the flaws. But again, I would like to go a little bit in a more systematic way. So, I was saying, talking a little bit about the motivations of Israel to go to the resolve side. And, you know, I had a lot of conversation with all sorts of people who were some central and some marginal people in that enterprise. I spent a little time with Peres. He was never a serious one of my interviewees, but I spent with a lot of many other people. And I recall that in my first conversation at Kibbutz Iron with Israel, with Sini, who was the aide of Israel Galili, who was around that for years and years and years. And by the way, he told me that in 1954, when there was no even yet a nuclear project, he wrote something, a short article. 1954, it's just less than 10 years after the end of World War II, about the tension between nuclear weapons and democracy. And he published it, of all places, in the little journal, the little newsletter of the Kibbutzi movement that he was part of that. But it was something that was in his mind. And later on, he went with his boss, with Israel Galili, and he was associated with him in various kind of things. And I remember in the first interview that I had with him, he told me, this project was born out of ultimate fear. It was a response to fear. It was a response to anxiety, a survival anxiety. This was what pushed Ben-Gurion into that. And I think it's very, very true. I think Ben-Gurion, among all the Israeli leaders of the time, of the first decade of Israel history, was the one who had a great deal of skepticism and doubt about Israel's ability to survive in the future. He didn't trust the army. He was, in some respect, I don't like to use this word because it would be anachronistic, but it was somewhat racist about the Sephardi, the new immigration that came to Israel, he didn't believe that they're going to, it will take them a long time to cultivate themselves, and he believed that the IDF at the time is not a good one, and therefore he was looking for some element of ultimate security. And for him, the fact that Israel had advantage, some edge in science and technology was for him something that we should seek. One time he was saying, in the 50s, just as Jewish scientists were able, by and large, were able to bring the United States of America during the Manhattan Project, the bomb, so our own Israeli scientists would be able to bring us also the bomb. I mean, if you think why Israel under Ben-Gurion thought about it as feasible, that kind of project, while for somebody next door neighbor such as Jamal Abdel Nasser, the effort, the desire to reach nuclear weapons was never felt as something realistic. It's that sense of confidence in science technology that Ben-Gurion had and Nasser did not have. Ben-Gurion was confident that science and technology, by the way, this is almost rephrasing Shimon Peres, who was his chief executive officer, who was essentially executing that kind of thing. From his autobiography, he was saying that science technology could compensate what nature has deprived us as a nation. We don't have enough people, we don't have resources, and we have to rely on science and technology. Historical memories, the story of Samson, who ultimately had to kill them with himself, the story of Masada, another big image, historical image, obviously memories of pogroms and ultimately the Holocaust play a great deal in the desire to get that kind of ultimate security. Not many people know that during even the War of Independence, at least Israeli War of Independence, 1948, until roughly June 1948, it was unclear at all whether Israel's chances to survive and to establish itself as a state are that great and that clear. The situation was very much iffy. It was a great of disorganization and dismobilization on the Arab side, Arab-Palestinian side, that ultimately Israel was able to prevail. But Ben-Gurion was very much aware that that young Israel had a great deal of luck. So the desire to look for some kind of ultimate things beyond the regular army, to look for the nuclear options, was in the mind of Ben-Gurion from very much early on. Here's Ben-Gurion. Again, this is some of the elements that I mentioned. Another element in his motivation was the notion that there is no chance to get his desire in his search for security guarantees for Israel borders, ceasefire of 1949, was very strong. He was looking it from the United States. He never got it. Various kind of presidents. It was clear to him that Israel cannot join into NATO. The door is not there. The chance for Israel to be part of NATO is not there. And he was haunted by all sorts of worst-case scenarios. One of them is what he called mikre hakol in Hebrew. It's the case of everything. And the case of everything means a grand coalitions of all Arabs. In reality, it never happens. A war coalitions against Israel. And he was haunted by that kind of fear. For him, the proposition, which today is so obvious, that Israel is there as the strongest nations, at least militarily, in the Middle East, was not obvious at all. It was not a trivial thing at all. And therefore, his search for, his quest for nuclear weapons, for the nuclear options, was very much to compensate what he was so much worrying about. So it was this anxiety, no external alliance with anybody outside can provide Israel some kind of security guarantees, and therefore Israel is in seek for stable deterrence for the long term. His view was Israel cannot afford every 8, 10 years to have another fight, because ultimately Israel can lose, and Israel could not, in his mind, Ben-Gurion's mind, Israel cannot lose one single time. So this was the very strong the elements of the resolve. By the way, this was a view of the national leader. Essentially all other national leaders lower than Ben-Gurion, maybe putting aside Golda Meir, even though she was not, at that time she was not a prominent, actually she was very much concerned about the political feasibility of that project. But essentially nobody else around him in the leadership believed in it the way he did. This is such a national need. And people in the military, even though the Israeli military at the time was relatively small, none of them were seeking nuclear weapons. They wanted more money and more allocations and more resources to strengthen the regular army, conventional army. But it was Ben-Gurion's obsession. So the notion of fear, anxiety, and not just a general national fear and anxiety, but a fear and anxiety of one particular individual who happened to be the national leader. And it's interesting that the initiative, the initial nuclear decisions of a number of states are very much connected with the initial decisions with one particular leaders. In the United States is FDR, and then the people that he put in the United Kingdom, it's Attlee. With France, it's de Gaulle and one or two prime ministers before him. But it's not necessarily a question of general consensus, but it's often obsessions of one particular leader. Countries that consider it, for example, such as Sweden or Swiss, they made preparation, but there was no any sense of strong leader who really put all his power into that proposition, and ultimately they gave up. But in some of the countries, Israel is a very, very special case in that there was one leader that initially was very, very critical. I think had anybody else would have been at the helm in Israel at that time, Israel would not be today a country with, at least with the kind of nuclear program and with the kind of nuclear infrastructure that it has today. So it was very much, I call it a triumvirate. It was Ben-Gurion as the political leader who gave the authority and legitimacy. It was the fact that he had a chief executive officer such as Shimon Peres who put his own political future into that thing. This was the big thing that he did in his life. And there was one scientist, one technocrat who was gearing the R&D structure of the military to go that direction, a man called Professor A.D. Bergman. But this triumvirate was very much responsible for that. Had Israel not had that kind of triumvirate, most likely it wouldn't have that kind of program today. So individuals, key individuals, and in particular national leaders, play a great deal of role. Now I want to mention a few things on the side of caution. And on the side of caution, you find Ben-Gurion himself, and after him in particular, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol. It was from Ben-Gurion's first statement that he already took the side of caution. He didn't leave essentially an inch, a millimeter, as the Israelis said, to explain or to give connections of the project that relates to the issue of security. He claims that the project is all about science, future, agriculture, all sorts of development projects, but it's not about security. He did not even leave the option of security because he wanted so much to avoid confrontation and to avoid any situation of antagonism, political antagonism with any country, in particular given the fact that the United States at the time, already under Eisenhower, was already quite suspicious about that kind of project. So from the very beginning, we find those strong elements of caution, the other side of the dilemma. Ben-Gurion started to have a confrontation with President Kennedy. By the way, in historical perspective, President John Kennedy was probably the most committed to the cause that today we call non-proliferation than any other president, and in particular, he was ready to bring the issue into almost direct confrontation with Israel, not open, not public, but private, with Ben-Gurion. Interestingly enough, Ben-Gurion resigns as the confrontation came to the very peak. It was not many people know that Ben-Gurion resigned on June, I think it was June 16, 1963, literally as the US ambassador in Tel Aviv, a man called Ambassador Barber, Walworth Barber, was on its way literally to carry one of Kennedy's most harshest messages to Ben-Gurion, essentially asking American visits at Dimona under conditions which are almost like a defeated state, that would allow the United States to look and to inspect to the extent that the United States legally could not even ask. And yet he really insisted. Ben-Gurion resigned that day. A similar language, a similar letter, almost word by word, with a slightly different worded introduction, was written to Eshkol. Eshkol got it within 2 weeks after Ben-Gurion's resignation in early July. It took Eshkol and his aides 2 months to answer that request, that demand, essentially. And the United States, for the first time, and Kennedy was put it at that language, the United States would be ready to put its relation with Israel to jeopardize, that if Israel would not respond adequately to those demands, and those demands were technical, quite unlike presidential letters, essentially access to any part of the Dimona facility, the Israeli relationship with the United States, including the economic sides, United Jewish Appeal, and that kind of things, could be seriously jeopardized. The phrase "could be seriously jeopardized" was a presidential phrase from those letters. Interesting, again, the side of caution. Israel responds with a great deal of caution, at least in diplomatic manners. They continue to do what they wanted to do, but they allowed the United States to visit. It was important, ultimately, when practice came, that Israel would govern the way that those visits were made. But technically, initially, they say to Johnson, they say to Kennedy, okay, we accept, we give you, and after this 6 or 7 weeks of deliberations, they say almost full concession. So on the political side, it was again the element of caution. It so happened that Johnson was the one, President Johnson, LBJ, was the one who had to carry out those inspections. Israel was determined in terms of practice to keep its right to do. They decided essentially to cheat. And it was an elaborate project just to prepare the Dimona site for the American visits. And ultimately, it was hurdles. It makes it more difficult, but the work in Dimona continues over that period. But the statement that Eshkol made, and that became the official statement of Israel to this very day, was a reflection of that kind of caution. The statement was that Israel will not be the first nation in the region to introduce nuclear weapons. And essentially, even today, when Israel has nuclear weapons, that statement has survived. It survived President Nixon, and it goes all the way even today under President Obama. It's just amazing. And this is obviously a statement. This is a statement of ambiguity, which reflects a great deal of caution. So again, we see this dialectics between resolve and caution. Not many people know that when Prime Minister Eshkol passed away in early '69, and by early '69, Israel already had, this is by the way, in quite good resolution, in today's resolution, the Dimona facility. The Dimona facility can be seen today with, this is the reactor itself, and the big reprocessing plant, which was the big secret of Dimona for years, I believe it's this big of facility. That's where the plutonium is being made. It's a major facility, maybe 3,000 employees, all sorts of institutions. Essentially, Israel has direct access to the whole nuclear fuel cycles. And there are 3 layers of fences around that. If you go to Google Earth, it's kind of entertaining to drive around the patrol road that surrounded Dimona. There are 3 layers of fences. Often you can see even the balloon that protects it, that there is almost 24 hours a day kind of oversight and surveillance over that facility. And with Google Earth, you can pretend as if you're driving around. You do not have today in Google Earth the resolution that you have when you look at other facilities. The United States, as part of the legislation made many years later, does not allow Google to provide the highest resolution, essentially protecting. That's another way that the United States protect Israeli interest, including, and in particular, nuclear interest. You don't have, the resolution is much worse than the highest technical resolution. But that's essentially, that's still a nice picture of the facility. In any case, what I was starting to say is that in 1969, when Eshkol died, he was not even sure what's going to be the future status of that program and how far Israel would go. It was left to his next line, Golda Meir, to decide what would be the parameters and how far she would go. Whether Israel would sign the NPT and whether continue to lie, whether Israel would keep an option, whether Israel would have some stockpile of plutonium but without having the bomb. And it was ultimately her decision to push and to have the capability, but to do it under the same formula without going to the open. And indeed, she put it as a deal to President Nixon, and essentially he accepted it. Israel realized already that Nixon is committed, that he would agree. He is more attentive, more conciliatory to Israeli interest, and he would accept Israeli exceptionalism. And the deal essentially was Israel promised not to do any act which visibly would put the bomb outside, and in return essentially no test, no declaration, and to do whatever they do in a very low-profile way. That's Israel's side of the deal, of the bargain, of opacity. And in return, the United States would allow Israel to be outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel would be treated, at least temporarily, as an exception. The American visit to Dimona would end. Essentially, it's a charade, and time to end it. And essentially, the United States would provide Israel a certain kind of coverage in various kind of international fora. The Israeli formula remained as it was under Eshkol. Israel would not be the first one to introduce nuclear weapons. So essentially, this was the deal. The deal was, I believe, agreed by the Prime Minister and the President. I mentioned before that it's very difficult to look for the trace of paper. I tell the very story of that deal in great deal as the chapter 2 of this book, and I'm not going right now to repeat that story. It's a complex, in part bureaucratic, in part very exciting story of intelligence, foreign policy, limitations, recognition of limitations, and so forth. But I did try, both in Israel and the United States, at least to explore whether somebody in some kind of national repository place of archives of sort has the original document of what was said and agreed between the Prime Minister and the President. And I believe, I checked with the director at the time of Tim Naftali of the Nixon Presidential Library in California. He told me that he looked for me even in its vaults among the classified. He couldn't find anything, no trail of papers. If there is, and I believe there is, because I believe that somebody after the meeting, part of the meeting was, by the way, the two of them was walking around the Rose Garden outside the White House. They did not even discuss it in the Oval Office. So it was just the two of them. No note, nobody took notes, note taker. But I believe that the president dictated to somebody what was the result, what was the message that was agreed between the sides. And if it exists, we don't know, it's probably within the Nixon family. It's apparently not within the US National Archives huge collection. I checked with Israel, and again, I didn't ask to show me those documents, but at least I asked in the people who run the Israeli National Archive. They told me, we have a great deal of material of that visit in September 1969. We don't have any documents about that personal conversation between the President and the Prime Minister. What other people told me from the Atomic Commission was that all we have was a note, Xerox note from Yitzhak Rabin as the prime minister to Menachem Begin, made in 1977, 3 years later, 4 years later. What Rabin tells Begin, when Begin became the prime minister, he understands, Rabin was ambassador, by the way, at the time, so it's not only the prime minister, but also from the ambassador, what he believes is the status of the arrangement or the agreement between Israel and the United States on the nuclear issue. Just to show how sensitive was the issue, that the sensitivity was so strong that it could not tolerate a trail of paper. Even to leave classified, a highly classified trail of paper was too much. And maybe on this agreement, there is no, in any place official, trail of papers of that. Maybe. But this was the deal. What's interesting is that 1970, less than a year later in July, the New York Times was citing national intelligence estimate that was shared with Congress, and some of you know a little bit about classification. Those documents that are being shared with Congress, they are much less classified. They're usually at the level of only secret. Hundreds, if not thousands of people can see them, and immediately you know they can be leaked. And in this case, it was leaked to the New York Times, and essentially the title was, the United States know that Israel either has the bomb or has all the components of the bomb for the bomb. In other words, some ambiguity still survives at that point about the final status, the technical status of whatever devices or weapons Israel has, whether it's components, half assembled, full assembled, stored, stockpiled, ready to go. It was unclear, or at least they claimed to Congress that they do not know. But this was essentially a reflection of the deal, and the United States, ever since, treat the issue as the kind of taboo. I'm trying to go a little bit faster because we don't have a lot of time, and I would like you to engage you and to respond to some of your questions. It took years until opacity and until that kind of arrangement. Initially, it was an arrangement between the leaders themselves. And very, very close people around the leaders relevant to the essence of the decisions. Over the years, it became known to some others. It never became public, and it was never fully acknowledged, even in official documents. Even in official documents at the working levels, the mid-level, even the working levels. Over the years, it's become more and more entrenched and more solidified. Of course, the Yom Kippur War, especially the first few days, that Israel put a great deal of pressure to, and indeed there was a suggestion, proposal was made by Moshe Dayan at some forum with Golda Meir, and the Prime Minister ruled this out. Golda Meir ruled this out, in part because she knew exactly how much she was personally the one who swore to President Nixon that this is for deterrence only and will keep low visibility as much as we can. And she refused, at that time, 1973, even to prepare them for immediate action. The young proposal was, allow me to prepare them, not to use them yet, to prepare them for immediate action, and she did not give her consent for that, which is very interesting. I got recently a testimony, and I presented some documents as part of the Nuclear Proliferation International History Project of the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and one of the documents that one of the testimony that I presented was this interview that was given to me a few years ago about a person who was outside the room. He tells that kind of story. So opacity over the years, including the Gulf War, has become stronger. When India and Pakistan did their own test, Israel kept the opacity. The Israeli strategic benefits are obvious, and obviously Israelis fell in love with this. Essentially, Israel is recognized as de facto by the United States, but as a unique exception, but without paying the political price. That's fantastic. You have all the benefits with almost essentially no paying any political price. What else can you ask? Practically, Israel had essentially freedom of action. You are not reporting to anyone. You are not part of any kind of agreement the issue is not essentially you are not accountable to anybody. And again, this is a great freedom of action. Israel always want to keep in this area that kind of maximum freedom of actions. Israel is not part of the NPT. The United States gave its coverage. So strategically, it looks like you enjoy all the benefits you could enjoy, and you don't pay anything, any price for that. That's looks like fantastic. And again, I'm trying to provide why Israelis see it as a unique kind of situation, the only country that got that kind of arrangement. And again, the arrangement is not even public. The United States is committed to full secrecy about that kind of arrangement. It even prevents Israel from making a slippery slope, something that was concerned many, many years later in the context of what is known as the FMCT, the Fissional Material Cut-Off Proposal, which was a proposal for to keep what you have but not to produce additional fissional material. This was an idea for agreement, never signed, never became a treaty, never became a full thing, but at one time in the 90s, it was one of the issues that were floated, were discussed, and Israel opposed it, and it was prevailing in its opposition. So again, strategically, Israel seems to enjoy all the benefits that a nation could ask on the strategic side. And again, I want to emphasize that Israel could not have those benefits had it not been also a deal or a bargain that the United States is not just a passive, even though it was never acknowledged, it's not just a passive partner. The United States essentially made himself to be unique kind of active partners in defending and shielding Israel on this issue, and insisting that that the issue is not even on the table, it's not even being discussed in any public or semi-public, or even in most classified level of binational discussion. For example, there is a forum called, which senior officials participate of strategic consultations. The nuclear issue is not being discussed there. To the best of my understanding, from interviews I had with some people, the issue has been discussed very few times and only in the informal pleasure of conversation between the leaders. It was discussed, for example, between Ehud Barak and President Clinton. It was discussed later on, I think, between Ehud Barak and Obama, Olmert and Obama, and probably Netanyahu and Obama as well. When in the first summit, the nuclear summit that took place in Washington, D.C. in 2010, President Obama made all kind of linguistic acrobatics just not to acknowledge the unique exceptional. It's interesting to listen to his recording at that press conference. He was asked about Israel, and he gave this convoluted, interesting answer, just essentially not acknowledging that Israel is or has nuclear weapons and as a special case. So it's interesting that a great deal of this combination of sophistication and silliness has given to keep this arrangement alive and the thing. And the United States is paying some diplomatic and political costs for that. And it's important to know the United States is part of it. Israel could not have done it on its own. No way. However, to get that kind of smartness, and even though part of the motivation, not entirely, is caution, political caution, an attitude of what one may call sense of responsibility towards nuclear weapons, you do pay some moral and democratic value, and you pay a certain kind of cost, and there is a certain burden involved. In my book, and part of the effort of this book is really to articulate those elements, what they are, from legal perspective, from cultural, political perspective, from moral theory and political theory perspective, the fact that you don't have that the state, 40 years later, keep a full lacuna of activities that over the years, billions of Israeli money, dollars also, was invested into as something which is not being discussed. Essentially, it's off limits to political inside conversation. Very, very few people in the Knesset know some elements of that in a subcommittee of the Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee, and all the rest give up and say this is not our business. Essentially, it's a concession of the public to keep a full area of activities which touch upon some very fateful activities. How many you need, how much money you want, what is the nature of a national insurance policy? And again, since so much in the Middle East and in Israel itself has changed over the years, it's not Israel of David Ben-Gurion with his fear. I said that the whole business started with fear. Israel is no longer fearful. Israel is the most powerful nation in the Middle East, and when it's negotiated, for example, with the Palestinians, it negotiates with a position of enormous strength against the very weak Palestinians. It's not negotiation among equal partners, which puts some shades on the very nature of that kind of thing. And yet there is one aspect of the Israeli strength which could not part of the equation, which cannot be discussed, which is totally off limits. Is it good? Is it fair? Is it democratic? Is it good for Israel itself? I mean, all this kind of questions, which in my book I develop into full critique, are hardly even asked in Israel itself, and it's a matter of kind of tacit consent among Israelis. We agree, we don't discuss it among ourselves. In any forum, not even academic forum, those issues are not being discussed. And this already has been going on for almost 50 years after that deal was signed. And I think the deal was at the time as a temporal way to deal with some dilemmas. It was okay. I'm talking about the deal between Nixon and Golda Meir. But now, 50 years later, that both governments are so much committed, so one has to ask the question, is it still relevant? And again, I'm trying to develop this into a full critique. I agree, by the way, that if you want to ease it, if you want to open it up, it has to be done with a great deal of responsibility and caution. This is not something that you can be loose. And obviously the issue of Iran today does not make it easier. But at least to ask questions, how to do it, what its connection to the peace negotiations, in what way it can be introduced. Is it fair to give globally and regionally one nation that kind of exempt and to trust that everything is okay, even though nothing is public, when that kind of activity has no public face whatsoever? So these are the kind of moral, political issue that I raise in the book, and I raise it in quite elaborate way. Also, there is the issue of the preservation of history. This is an important part of history that Israel should know about itself. To what extent it's relevant to the discussion that took place in the last few years about Iran. If you ignore, if you put aside, if you don't give any legitimacy to this subject, something big, something fundamental is missing. And this is what I was trying to put in this book. So I know the time is running and it's already almost 4:20, so I'll stop here and I'll be very happy to respond to questions.
You know, don't you think, I mean, as I understand it, Israel now has 200 weapons, 200 nuclear weapons in that range. What? A little less. Right. So not talking about a small arsenal. I mean, this in contemporary standards, I mean, in the Cold War when there were, tens of thousands of weapons in the possession of the United States and Soviet Union, that was a very small arsenal. Now it ranks as a significant one, particularly in the Middle East. But don't you think that given the situation with Iran, given this 50-year history, that this tension between resolve and caution is no longer doesn't really describe the situation? I mean, caution's thrown out the window. I mean, they have an incredible number of weapons. They have everybody knows that it, as you say, very effectively, that it's a secret, but it's not a secret. And it's implicit in all the discussions about the threat that Iran poses to Israel, that they would use it if they needed to.
The Israelis?
Yeah.
I don't think so. First, I believe that the Israeli should. So ultimately, this discussion, even though I think that time has come to change, time to explore new venues and new ways to deal with it in Israel itself and with the United States, I still believe that opacity, a great deal of the motivation for it. I mean, there is a great deal of bureaucratic convenience to do what you do in complete darkness, that nobody really can bother you, from budgets to appointments. Everything essentially goes to the prime minister and nobody else knows. It's very, for bureaucrats, it's great to work under that kind of thing. But it is heaven. But at the same time, I do believe there is also elements of prudence, and the prudence is that when you keep low profile that capability, you give a sense that this is not the essential duty, that it's a national insurance policy, but it's not something that you think about in a serious way. So there is something good about it, but there is something that I think by now has become so anachronistic. I think for a nation like Israel, not to have, by the way, in terms of, you mentioned useful numbers, I don't know what's the real numbers. I believe that there is difference between whatever actual weapons they have and the amount of plutonium that can be used for weapons. This is two different things. They may have, and that's what the U.S. intelligence thought about it a decade ago, somewhere around 80 or 100 weapons, but they may have another quantities of plutonium that within short time could be converted into weapons. And these are not the same reserves or stockpile of fission materials ready for weapons. But I think it's internationally, I mean, every country that has nuclear weapons, putting right now nuclear, North Korea aside, which is, Israel does not want to be like North Korea in any way. Every country gave some kind of statement about what they think about nuclear weapons, even though sometimes it's lip service. Even the NPT put essentially all countries that have nuclear weapons are for the long run committed to nuclear disarmament. The British are perhaps the most transparent than any other nuclear weapon states. For Israel not to have any statement whatsoever and not to acknowledge, I think there is something almost at the verge of insulting for international community and for the Israelis themselves that this important issue has never, whatever it was done, and I'm not trying to say that Israel is not responsible, but it was done entirely in high classified bodies, and there is no any public face for that. I found it very, very disturbing, and I find it's disturbing the fact that the United States is still ready to live with it and giving a full coverage to it. And the fact that there is even not shred of readiness to start to explore how to go beyond that. And it's not easy. It's one thing to suggest what I'm suggesting, it's another thing to give specific proposal how to go beyond that. That is not easy. About Iran, and you asked the question about Iran, I think that there is no way to understand the Israeli response to Iran, and on this, Barak and Netanyahu, even though ideologically they're quite different in many respects, but on the bomb, I think both of them agree, and that was part of the whole, what happened in 2010 until 2012, and Benjamin Netanyahu made the impression that Israel was very close to take military action against Iran. I believe that the philosophy that guides both Barak and Netanyahu was, Netanyahu see it as a Iranian bomb or threshold capability as an existential threat to Israel. Ehud Barak does not see it. But in the eyes of Ehud Barak and Netanyahu, both of them think that if Israel should go to war in the worst case scenario, we should be ready and willing to go to war in order to keep monopoly. Israel must not allow that, like what happened to President Truman in the late 40s when ultimately the Soviet Union got the bomb. Israel cannot afford, short of war, to allow anybody in the Middle East, in particular not Iran, to reach the bomb. And Israel, and that's such a national imperative that Israel, to keep that monopoly alive, should be willing to go to war. And they believe it will be a tough war, but we will prevail. Now, I think to have a meaningful discussion about the Iranian situations, what I just said has to be, which there is nothing classified about it, except the fact that you acknowledge openly that Israel has nuclear weapons, and there is the issue of the monopoly. That should be on the table. Nothing like that in all the debate that took place in Israel, and some of it was amazingly in terms of revelation that what was going on. I mean, there was some indication to some operational planning that took place at a certain time, and certain kind of commands that were given by Netanyahu and Barak to the military levy to do. And by now we know that billions of American dollars were invested, more than 10, in the last 2 years of various kind of level of readiness and preparations towards a war with Iran in all aspects. And yet some of the basic aspect of that kind of debate had never been discussed by the public. I think there is something quite disturbing about that.
Yes, Chair.
Hello. I'm hoping I can articulate this. I will try. So earlier you were speaking about the role of trauma and anxiety stemming from the Holocaust in Israel, and I know you had said that that might not necessarily exist as strongly anymore, but I was wondering if you think there's sort of like a parallel experience happening in the United States regarding both the Holocaust and the relationship with the Middle East that might translate into foreign policy with Israel that sort of maintains this opacity that you were speaking to.
Well, what I was trying, and could be a subject for lecturing and so on, and I don't want to go into that. I think the Holocaust's level of impact on Israel politics and society today, it's not just the memory and its historical eventuality that was so different than anything Jews or others have had witnessed before that. But I'm saying that what I was trying to say is that I believe that the Holocaust as a trauma, as a national trauma, is living in Israel today. And I'm not sure if its impact on Israel today, especially in politics, especially in the way you think about others who in your neighborhood, are very useful and very allow Israel to normalize. So in many ways, Israel and Israelis have scars deep in their psyche that makes it much more difficult for them to see themselves in normalized way, not surrounded by enemies that do not accept them, and to try to open themselves towards a really negotiate new terms and new deal with the neighbors. In many ways, the presence of the Holocaust is internalizing a sense of history, a sense of enemy, that it's if Israeli society, Israeli politics cannot live without the notion that somebody is after them in the existential sense. And that, I believe that Israel today essentially is a very strong regional power, economically and of course militarily, and unless Israel would screw up itself in such a way that it would make its future so problematic, it does not have a threat from the outside. It's very much in the future of Israel, to what extent it's going to be Jewish state or Israeli state or whatever, it depends very much on the Israeli people and to what they're going to do with the Palestinians. I mean, if it's going to be one state, ultimately demography would win. But I don't think Israel is posing any military threat at the existential level today. And I think that a great deal of the way that Israel looks at Iran over the last few years, and the result is that it has impact on the United States, for better or worse, is to significant way because of the Holocaust. So the Holocaust makes Israel to be wounded even today, and it has even impact on the United States policy because the United States has to accommodate and to deal with Israel as a close ally and as the whole neurotic relationship between Israel and the United States that exists to these days. So the reality of the Holocaust is not just historical reality. In some respect, it's even a present-day reality. That's what I was trying to say, and it can be said much more elegant, and some other people express it, but that's the general direction I was trying to.
Sure. Can you grab a mic? Yeah.
Why?
I listen to you.
Yeah.
David, use that.
Well, David Toppel. I'm a doctoral student at the PhD program in criminal justice. You mentioned not only, I mean, the existential or the trauma of the Holocaust, and but at the same time you say that and I agree with you that objectively Israel negotiates from a position of superiority, but I wanted to call your attention and ask you for a comment on, there are scholars like Professor Arnold Kleineman from University of Tel Aviv in a paper about Israeli and Palestinian negotiation culture, where he says that it's true that from the objective point of view, Israel could be, you know, in defense very superior to the counterparts, but everything is existential. There is an existential fear all the time, especially among the elite. These are his arguments in a very, very simplified arguments. He does not only speaks about the scar of the Holocaust, he speaks about 5 Arab-Israeli wars, where inside Israel they are not perceived as, Israel is perceived as the part that didn't initiate the war or the conditions to go to war. So when this is translated to the, you know, the nuclear domain, this is, you know, even magnified. The same thing happens with, I mean, not only with Holocaust and the war, but the Israeli-Arab wars. It's also a matter of, you know, of history. It's also, when you say about negotiating with the Palestinians in Israel, it's the conflict with the Palestinians is seen in the context of the Arab world, where Israel is the size of New Jersey in front of, I mean, even, you know, this, and I'm speaking about subjectiveness, I'm not speaking about, so what can you say about that? Yes, thank you.
You know, your question was loaded with all sorts of assumptions and all sorts of beliefs and all sorts of things, which obviously I don't have the time or the ability right now to address all, but I will say very flatly some of my own view. I think that to some extent, during the first 2 decades, and perhaps the watershed, historical watershed, was the 1967 war that changed it. If not 67, the 70s. But I think the big victory of 67 was that took Israel beyond the existential threat. And I believe that, you know, we're still living in a situation that there is conflict in the region, especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has not been resolved. That's a fact of life. And from time to time, there are sporadic waves of violence. I wouldn't call it existential violence. Look, the fact that there are some fragments of the Palestinian society, which, in my view, and again, it's very, very loaded, so we can go to the entire exchange between you and I, but I'm just putting a few things. The fact that some elements in the Palestinian society are still extreme, this is the extreme of the weak side, the side that accepts rhetorics, has very, very little in terms of actual weapons. So the Hamas have some rockets that can reach even Tel Aviv. They can reach maybe even beyond that. This is not existential threat to Israel. Israel can launch its air force and can demolish so much of that. I mean, the imparity in pains and damage that each side can impose on the other are days and nights between Israel and the Palestinians. So I believe that the existential issue, putting the nuclear issue in Iran, and even here I think there is a great deal of overextension. Of course, if you don't resolve the Israeli-Palestinian issue, there still remains conflict in the area. And that conflict, as long as one side, the weaker side, feel itself deprived from basic rights and does not have even the most basic rights that they think they deserve, the conflict will continue. For some time it will be diplomatic, for some other times it will be mixed with some violence. If you don't try to settle that and you don't reach settlements, I believe that today, and therefore the questions of whether it was ultimately good and bad, it's an interesting one, because to some extent I think the bomb, especially from the 70s onward, after the 73 war have led to, in significant way, to the realization on the Arab side that time has come to find a way to live with Israel. The peace with Egypt, Sadat, 1977 to 1979, the negotiation ultimately the peace of 78 and so forth. This was in part, and indeed what Sadat told some Israelis, including the Israel Minister of Defense at the time, as a Weizmann, I came to here because of the nuclear age. I find the way that we must find a way to live because we cannot afford ourselves to escalate. The 1973 war was the last war of that nature between big armies. Later on, peace with Jordan. Today, essentially, Israel has either some kind of way of existence with other Arab states or de facto acceptance in the Gulf, a great deal of business between Israel and the Gulf state, Qatar, and other states is being done today. To some extent, the Israeli bomb and the sense of Israel is going to stay there helped for reaching at least de facto Arab recognition. On the Israeli side, perhaps the bomb, and that's the other side of the glass, has allowed Israel to think that we do not need peace. That we can impose on the weaker side such terms that they can never be accepted, and that's essentially what the Likud, what Netanyahu is offering to the Palestinians, terms that they cannot live with, essentially terms of the vanquished, the side who was defeated, or we don't need peace. It would be nice to have that, but for now we can hold it. It will take them more time to learn that we are the strongest, and that's it. So in some ways you can ask the question, the question has hardly been asked in Israel, to what extent the psychological, political, not military, because everybody knows that nuclear weapons Israel would never use. Chuck mentioned the fact that Israel could use it against Iran. I don't think so. I cannot conceive, unless Israel being attacked by Iranian nuclear weapons, and that's not in the cards for years from now, even the worst case scenario, I do not see any circumstance in which Israel use nuclear weapons, even against Iran. If Israel would go to war against Iran, it would be conventional, would be cyber, would be all sorts of tricks and all sorts of stuff, but lower than the nuclear level. I do not see at all. But at the same time, it made Israel to think that it is such a big power. Nobody outside can, with strong economy, so nobody has a leverage and a way to pressure Israel that Israel can say to the world, we don't care. We have our own way of thinking, and that's essentially what various kind of people in the Likud, even on the right side of Mr. Netanyahu, thinks, and we can do it. Because it's not effective, any kind of whatever sanctions, it's not in the coming. The United States defend us. Obama is, and the Europeans are not going to dare anything. It's nice to have some semblance of negotiation, but we can be the tough and we can afford. And if the negotiation is going to broken and going to shattered, that's fine. That's the attitude of the Likud. Israel does not truly need peace. And I wonder, and that question has hardly ever been asked in Israel itself, to what extent the bomb has added to that mental state, to that attitude. And I believe some. Yes.
You just say,
yourself, please.
Roger Shengarten, I'm a student here.
You're a professor here?
No, I'm a student. You just say Israel does not need peace. Is it maybe...
I'm saying that some circles in Israel, including some circles close to the ruling parties, the people, I believe they have that kind of attitude.
Yeah, I agree, but is there not also another view that many of these circles do not believe that real peace is achievable now, and that the hatred and the deepening of the conflict, which was first to nationalism and now has become even more and more religious, make peace unrealistic?
Look, I believe there is a great deal of rationalizations among the Israelis to believe that so-called the soil is not ripe, it's not ready. There are some structural issues that, there is refugees and there is Jerusalem and there is all sorts of the so-called the core issue, and the two sides are too far away. there is no question that among many of those issues there is a great deal of difficulty. They're not easy issues. But in my view, the prevailing views of Israel, especially the current, the Likud-led government in Israel, is such that either it will be peace on our own strong terms, and we will appear as really the one who gets. I mean, essentially, they are not ready to give up Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and the strength of the lobby of the settlers is so strong that they're not ready to make any. I mean, you know, there is I hate those phrases, but these painful compromises. You know, Netanyahu in his speech, the so-called the Bar Ilan speech, you refer to that. In reality, I don't believe they show any beginning towards so-called painful compromises. They're not ready even to do the little paper that Kerry was trying to produce, even here. Yes, the Palestinians have some of their own issue, but the partners are so unequal, are so different in terms of the strength and the might that they bring to the table. So I think that a great deal is on the Israeli side because it's not negotiation among partners, among equals. And I think time has come to try to think to what extent Israel, once you acknowledge as a nuclear power, has contributed, has added to that sense of arrogance. To what extent behind it there is also an element of nuclear arrogance. I'm putting this as a question, not as a necessary answer, and I acknowledge that to do that kind of research, it's not an easy, because the issue is not very tangible for research. It's very difficult to, in academic terms, to put it into concrete parameters because the nuclear issue is hardly being seen. It's not truly visible. And therefore I'm using more somewhat fuzzy psychological terms in terms of mindset, attitude, and so forth.
You know, I think that what you're just saying about how the bomb, the mere existence of the bomb inhibits the will for peace is a excellent, it's a brilliant way to think about it. But it's part of the way in which we often, by not talking about the bomb and not trying to understand it and reflect on it, focus much too much attention on the extreme, terrifying uses of the bomb and not so much the cost of the mere existence of the bomb in the world. So that Richard Falk, for example, thinks that the existence of nuclear weapons in the world profoundly compromises democracy itself. Right.
He wrote in the ruling that I edited.
That you read. Okay, we both know Richard Falk, right? Lifton, of course, has argued that the bomb, one of the greatest dangers is the existence of the bomb evokes apocalyptic energies in extremist groups. So that, and now you're adding to that sort of that argument, this idea that Israel's politics in general are undermined. Any kind of will to peace is undermined by the mere existence of the bomb. I mean,
I believe so, and it's to some extent. So there is. I mean, I think it's interesting to compare the kind of argument that I'm trying to say with both Lifton and Richard Falk. The two of them are talking about a process of corrupting of the psyche, corrupting of politics, in a way that it's very difficult to put exact. There is a sense of infusing, a sense of somehow it's being swallowed into that, but it's very difficult exactly. And I think that the same thing in Israel, even though the issue is not being discussed in a tacit way, I think it gave many Israelis the sense that, you know what, we don't need it that much. If it's not either our way or no way, but we are so strong that only they have to make the real compromise. And with a great deal of self-righteous attitude that unfortunately come to that. And in my opinion, it's so a project that was just historically and strategically fair at the time. And again, I'm talking about the sense of the world and the picture of the world in the 50s has become, and indeed even supported peace, because it led to Israel being accepted and recognized as de facto something that's going to be there, has become over the years, over the decades, something that has corrupted the willingness and the authentic interest in peace. And there is inhibitions even to discuss it, even to consider it, because we don't talk about that. This is not part of the legitimate debate.
Do I need the mic?
Yeah.
This is being recorded. The whole 9 yards. Jim Jones, professor at Rutgers University. I think your point about the disappearance of history is really important, because I don't think it's coincidence that Israel, and I'm not interested in defending Iran as somehow the moral high ground on this issue at all, so don't misunderstand me. But that Israel made an agreement with the United States that they consciously cheated on, and then they're constantly invoking this refrain, well, you can't trust the Iranians because they cheated on. If there was a greater historical consciousness about Israel's own cheating on agreements that it made not with an opponent but with supposedly its ally, there might be more subtlety in those discussions in the Israeli discussion.
I fully agree with it. I think that both the elements of the Holocaust on the one hand and demonization of the others and attributing, and it's not that, Iran talks about denial of the Holocaust was just adding to that, denial of the Holocaust and not giving Israel legitimate right to exist, that kind of attitude this was under Ahmadinejad. But even today with Zarif and Rouhani, it's easier for Israel, especially under Netanyahu, to take as if, just cosmetic difference between Ahmadinejad and the current leaders and that kind of attitude. Also, in terms of your attitude towards negotiation. And that's a concrete issue. Almost everybody who knows something about nuclear matters and also about Iran as an emergent power today knows that Iran would, even in negotiation, would keep itself to be, and it's not disallowed by the NPT. It's not prevented, it's not something that the NPT does not allow, to be close to a threshold state. Now, because Israel, and in part looking at what Israel has been doing in its own nuclear history, and Israel was after the bomb. I think Iran is very much after being a threshold, being ability to be close to the bomb, the proximity to the bomb, not necessarily the bomb itself. But Israel looked at Iran and see Israel. They're doing mirroring. They're doing their own nuclear quest, which were so determined, at least in the eyes of some. And therefore, it corrupts the very negotiation with Iran. And there is the danger that the United States, instead of being the responsible adult, could go into the Israeli thing, could be pushed by, and especially when Israel is threatening, essentially, if we're not going to like the deal, we're going to attack. So there are issues about the very neurotic relationship between Israel and the United States, which are present today in the context in terms of attitude towards Iran, which allow to poison the issue from, cold, serious way of assessment to full of prejudices and loads that cover and put shape that discussion and that assessment. So I agree with you.
Yeah. That doesn't seem to be on. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Hi, Paul Gates. I'm an undergrad here. Just for a second, I'm curious about the American position. It seems America is taking on a great cost, both politically and morally, in the region around the world, allowing Israel to not sign the nuclear proliferation treaty and, in a sense, protect it. I'm looking to get a better understanding of what reasoning the U.S. had for taking on this undertaking, or what motivated it.
I think it's interesting. At the time of Nixon, there was a number of issues at stake. First, Israel, to some extent, reached the basic capability even before there was the non-proliferation treaty. Second, I think that Nixon came to the realization that Israel is not going to sign the NPT. Israel already has passed the point that you can sign the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. And therefore, pragmatically, the basic thing to do for the time being is to ignore the NPT, to allow the Israel line or stance of caution to continue, and to get some kind of, ultimately, some kind of the United States satisfactions that Israel is indeed fully responsible. And as long as Israel does it low profile, the United States could tolerate it. This was around 69, 70 when I think that the deal was made. I think the deal at the time was convenient for both sides, and it was in many ways reflections of some kind of real politics of the time. And by that time there was some ambiguity about the details of the Israeli capability. Israel had maybe half a dozen material for weapons. In 67 it has a device. It's not clear to what extent the United States intelligence knew it. So there was indeed an element of ambiguity, and the president decided, it's not worth for us to confrontation with Israel. This is still the context of Cold War, and therefore this is kind of reality, and let's make some kind of pragmatic deal for the time being. I don't think that neither he nor Mrs. Golda Meir expected that that kind of bargain that they made at the time with the concrete limitations of the time would survive for so many decades after. And the question is today whether it's right for the United States to to pretend as if we don't know anything, not to ask Israel to be accountable. Part of the issue then was to try to make the Arab response as low profile as possible, to give the Arab excuse not to look into that, not to incite some kind of regional arms race. Look, the Arabs are not fools. 45 years later, everybody knows that Israel is the bomb. So that kind of game that the emperor has no clothing was to some extent appropriate to the historical reality of 1969, 1970. But to continue with that kind of game almost half a century later, it's anachronistic. It's not just anachronistic, it does not reflect the basic in politics and the attitude towards nuclear weapons. How exactly to deal with it? I mean, Israel cannot go like South Africa and dismantle what it has and become a non-nuclear weapon state. That's not going to happen. So you need some element of recognition, you need some elements of acknowledgement from Israel, from others, and you need some elements of open caution with some sense of accountability, with some public element of that. And the most optimal way to think about it is to try to connect it to some kind of political deal. The problem is that there is so much fear. I mean, the element of the taboo, this is an untouchable issue, is so strong that neither side or others are ready to open and to try to rethink about it. And I found that when it's the establishment of the United States and of other countries, it's paralyzing, and it allows those double standards and all sorts of issues that the United States does not want to tackle, but it reflects a certain reality. The United States does have double standards in terms of Israel and others. It's a permanent or semi-permanent situation of exception, and it's become increasingly problematic politically, let alone morally and otherwise. So I don't have a immediate formula, and I think that the formula has to be tailored in the context of some kind of solution. But it has to be at least discussed and explored, because there is something for the long run intolerable in that kind of situation.
Professor, how has the Geneva interim agreement, which went into effect in January, affected Israel's policy? What indications have you gotten about any change or possible change in policy?
The reality is that, I don't think that we're going to have within 6 months to have a new permanent agreement. So we're going to, I think, we're going to remain within the context of the interim agreement for some time. I hope that there will be extension of that. For one thing, Israel no longer has in reality, Israel has no longer military option. Even if Prime Minister Netanyahu from time to time or Bogi Ya'alon, the Minister of Defense, makes from time to time noises as if they do have military option, the military option, the Israeli military option does not truly exist. For Israel to take military action at this point, because with all the imperfections of the present interim agreement, and there are many, many imperfections, some more conceptual, some more technical, at least it contained the situation and it makes Iran to keep some distance with better means of inspection, far from being perfect, but better means of inspections and safeguard than before. I think the challenge for long-term agreement would be, again, you'll have to discuss about firewalls to delineate what's could be peaceful, what's not peaceful, to give some methodology for what's peaceful and what's not peaceful, and ultimately to live with Iran with a certain kind of degree of proximity to the bomb, but at the same time to create those firewalls, my language, that would give a sense of timely warning in case Iran would break out. The notion that you can, just as you cannot dismantle Israel's nuclear weapons, real nuclear weapons today, and that's unrealistic, to believe that you can suddenly make a situation of no centrifuge, zero centrifuge in Iran, it's unrealistic. It's extremely unrealistic, and there is no legal backing or argument that could force Iran to push to that position. The question is how many centrifuges that they would have, and to have situation to install various kind of mechanisms that would give you timely warning, and then you go into more technical discussions about that. But I think for Israel the situation is that right now, if the agreement is being kept, at least in the basic, and I think so far has been kept, the military options that Israel claimed to have had to take action no longer in existence, unless Iran would violate that.
Well, you know, on that very moderately hopeful note, I think we could wind up. Before I formally close it, I just want to note we will meet again on May 2nd, so it's 4 weeks. But we don't have this room. Martha Crenshaw is going to talk, but we're going to be where we were last time in L63. So just because I know some of you last time came here and you didn't read my email, but you know, just I'll tell you now, I'll tell you again, so you will all know. Well, this has really been a wonderful presentation. His book is there for sale, and as I often say, there's no greater narcissistic pleasure for an author than to sign copies of the book. I know that Israel has been continually annoyed by Avner Cohen, but I think we can all agree. I think we can all agree we're very glad you're not in prison.